Are you overwhelmed by the challenge of personalizing communication for thousands of students? That's where Element 451's AI assistants come in. From nudging prospective students to guiding those already on their journey, AI assistants don't just automate, they write, build, and optimize every step of your digital campaigns. Discover how at element451.com/AI team.
Welcome to Mastering the Next, a cutting-edge podcast that explores the future of graduate, online, and non-traditional education through the lens of AI and technology. I'm your host, Dr. Ray Lutsky, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Element 451. Join me for discussions with some of the thought leaders shaping the future of graduate enrollment management through technology. Mastering the Next is a part of the Enrollify Network, a robust collection of podcasts designed to help higher education professionals like you grow. Explore our other shows at enrollify.org or check out some of my personal favorites linked in the show notes below. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform that helps institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com. Financial aid is something that's been on the mind of a lot of higher ed leaders this past year, particularly with the botched rollout of the new FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. We're joined by Dan Currell, who served as Deputy Undersecretary and Senior Advisor in the U.S. Department of Education from 2018 to 2021, and now, among other things, serves on the board of Adro, a company providing U.S. banking solutions for international students studying in America. He will help us demystify the world of federal financial aid policy and the future of student aid. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Ray, it's a lot of fun to be with you. I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks. I'm going to start with a big question. What's next for financial aid policy in the United States from your perspective?
We've been in the weeds of the FAFSA problem, and I've written about that a little bit here and there. And partly, I'll be honest, I wrote about it because I realized that I didn't completely understand it either. And so by the end of it, I almost completely understood it, I think. I'll say, let me just start with what's going well with the FAFSA. You know what's going well with the FAFSA is it's still free. Like, that part of it is totally true. It's definitely free. I'm not aware of any place where you have to pay for the FAFSA. So that part's working. Everything else, I think, is in some doubt. It's wrapped up, unfortunately, to me, my way of thinking, and I have a bit of an alternative, I guess, point of view on this thing, because I don't take for granted that any aspect of the system necessarily must work the way that it does. And that, I think, I probably depart from most people who are professional, kind of lifelong administrators in higher ed, but I am I'm probably aligned with 99% of parents, families, students, whatever, right? In other words, nobody looks at the system and says, hey, this is natural and intuitive. Obviously, there's going to be a considerable period, no matter what happens, right, in the election, and we'll get to that maybe too, but there's going to be a period of trying to reestablish, credibility between federal student aid, that subgroup within the Department of Education, and higher ed. And it's, I guess I can't say I was intimately close to the state of that relationship 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but I'm not aware that there's been, this level of broken trust, right? And it's very interesting to see people, on the higher ed side who, are obviously very, very much aligned, I think, in terms of their worldview with the people that are in federal student aid, getting up and testifying in front of, the House and whatever else, and making public statements that are really, elevating levels of frustration. So there's a reestablishment of trust. But here's the thing. It's just extraordinarily, and in defense of everybody, this is really complicated stuff. Not because it must be complicated, but because it simply is. And so when you look at sort of the contracting that took place and the software that has to be written and all this kind of stuff, it's like, granted that mistakes were made, but the particular people that are sitting in front of a computer screen, cursing their life or choices or whatever to have whatever job they have to try and, fix this thing, I really have all along felt terrible for them, right? I mean, there's some contractor at, a software firm, whatever, and they didn't create this problem. One of the things I found when I looked really deeply into the thing, in terms of the first round of FAFSA difficulties, because we are now into what appears to be a second, hopefully less serious round, now in the end of 24. But in the call it the 23 to 24 cycle of FAFSA problems, one was the principal contract was awarded to the vendor like a year or maybe a little over a year before the thing was supposed to go live. So right there. Right. It's like a sailboat race where it's not over yet, but you definitely know who's losing, right? You just kind of go like, look, this thing there's no way, right? This is a slow moving problem. Another thing that I discovered, which was just particularly funny to me as somebody I was born in 72. So, in my early professional career, the first great cataclysm was Y2K. Turned out to be absolutely nothing, perhaps because we did a good job of managing it. But anyway, Y2K crawled back out of the swamp for the FAFSA thing, which is hilarious because one of the many listed defects of the FAFSA was that any student that was born in the year 2000 was put into an infinite loop and basically lost in cyberspace and couldn't finish their application. Well, of course, that only includes, I don't know how many tens of millions of people that were born that year. And so, it's all a problem. So there's that rebuilding thing. On the policy side, look, it's going to have to depend, I think, on, and this is at the risk of a very long answer, it'll depend a little bit on the election. Let's just say that we continue the Democratic administration, right? It's a Harris administration. So if we stipulate to that, because it's honestly, and I can comment on this, obviously, as having served previously in a Republican administration, it's pretty hard to conjecture as to what would come next, but I'm happy to talk about that too. Let's just say in the Harris administration, it's clearer in a way, right? Because there's regulatory processes that are in flight. They're just currently going. And so you have the different repayment programs, the principal platform of this administration being SAVE, the Saving on a Valuable Education thing, and it's a repayment process that has pretty considerable loan forgiveness. As to whether that program survives, I think a lot of commentators feel like it won't. I am not totally sure about that because whether it survives is primarily a function, probably, of standing doctrine, which has nothing whatsoever to do with paying loans or loans at all. It has something to do with legal procedure. And so I think there's a question of how the Supreme Court would treat it from a standing perspective, and then whether it would be subject to the major questions doctrine. And again, I don't totally know whether it would lose at the Supreme Court on that one. It might not. So I think there's an open question there, and that would presumably be resolved in the next year or two. So that's one thing. And I think, it certainly appears to be the case that this administration is determined to continue to make efforts, right? Like they can, so if the SAVE program itself is determined by the court to be, to exceed the boundaries, right, to violate the Administrative Procedures Act and to go too far, there are plenty of other regulatory channels, right? If you've got another 4-year window to go through to continue to affect the ultimate policy goal of significant loan forgiveness. What I find to be missing from the whole conversation, and I think it's the only thing that's really important in the long run, and I don't mean to diminish how important the question is of what to do with this $80,000 or $40,000 or $120,000 in loans that any particular person has, but what I find to be important in the long run is, how do we as a country pay for higher ed? Like that's actually the question that matters from a public policy perspective, and I don't hear anyone talking about it. If you read the SAVE regulation preamble and just kind of everything reasonably closely, it does kind of suggest what the long run looks like, and it's not totally incoherent, but it's not what anyone would design, right? So the long run ends up, let's just imagine that the SAFE program were to survive judicial challenge and become a long-running program. Basically, the equilibrium would be people, especially graduate students, would take out loans, and really your incentive would be to take out the max. There is no max for graduates, but to take out a lot, let's just say. And for undergrads, it might well be to take out the max. which right now is about 31,000 for most undergraduates, because it would be a little bit crazy not to. And then what that effectively becomes is almost kind of like a financial instrument that hedges your future. And if you end up earning a lot, then you pay back the full amount. And if you end up earning really anything more than a lot, you probably wouldn't pay back the whole amount. And I guess that would just continue forever. The difficulty there, it seems to me, is that although there are limits on what undergraduates can borrow, you can borrow $5,500 in your first year of college, and I think it's $6,000 the second year, and the total cap for an undergraduate degree is $31,000, unless you're independent, which is relatively rare. There's a cap for that, so that could be a long-term equilibrium. You could kind of like function in that system. But for grad school, they'd have to put some kind of a cap in. I'm not sure anyone's going to do that in Congress, but they'd have to put a cap in for lending, because the system could become pretty weird. If you knew that you were going to go into public service, right? Like you're just like, I'm going to get a federal job, which, labor markets and demographics being what they are, I think it would be a reasonable bet that you could get a federal job. Let's say, so you go to Georgetown Law School, you say, hand me a federal job. Honestly, under the current provisions of the SAVE program, as I read them, there's no difference between borrowing $50,000 and $350,000. It's the same amount of money. Like, not to Georgetown, it's the $350,000, but to you, it's the same amount of money. You're going to make payments under terms that would be the same payments either way, and then your obligations would be extinguished at some point. And so, from a policy standpoint, that can't possibly make sense. And so, it's that kind of a scenario that people are worried about. I will say though that because people tend to make to fail to make good distinctions here, a lot of the conversation takes place as if undergraduates are doing this kind of a thing today. That's not possible. You can't. And the only way that you can borrow a ton for undergrad is if parents or relatives take out a Parent Plus loan, but none of those kinds of things have really been contemplated in the SAVE program as far as I see. And so parents, and this has been interesting to me, but I think some of the more concerning stories that you hear in financial aid are where families, right, parents are taking out big loans for young people to go to college. I would say arguably unnecessarily, because they could have gone to a very good state school, et cetera, for less. But anyway, they do this. I've not seen any proposals for helping those people out. And so that's that. But then grad students are contemplated in the SAVE program for sure, and they get covered. And so you need to figure out how to moderate that.
And there's certainly a lot going on, and thinking about the different aspects of policy, whether that's the actual applying for aid or the forgiveness of aid, or whether how much you're going to borrow, and thinking about it from a legislative, judicial, and executive perspective. It's a lot swirling there. So from your perspective, the regulatory landscape for higher ed is probably something that undergraduate and graduate leaders need to be thinking about. Where we are today, do you see things changing? I mean, you just kind of talked about the idea that there is no equivalent on the undergraduate side to think about what's going on the grad side with SAVE. So what regulations might be coming, and maybe this has a lot to do with who wins the election, around grad and undergrad programs, and what should higher ed leaders be thinking about coming down the pike?
When I came into the administration, this is in 2018, I just got hit, with a fire hose, and I don't think I did well. Actually, I was in an area where I think I can say I was incapable, in hindsight, of doing lasting harm. I remember telling my wife when I took the job, like, well, as long as I don't end up having to work on borrower defense, like, it'll be fine. And so, of course, that's what I was given to work on. And I say I was incapable of doing lasting damage because, the whole thing was such a mess. I am guilty of not making it better, but I don't think I could possibly have made it worse. And it was in the following way, and this is all just kind of a setup to the answer on the regulatory landscape. Unfortunately, things now are very much like that one was at the time, which was it was so tangled in various different pieces of litigation that were challenging the rule that after a little bit, probably too long, it took me to figure out, I figured out that nobody knew what the actual rule was. So I just said, well, as of today, what is the current rule? And realized that it was going to take a few days for me to try and reconstruct a hypothesis of what that would even be, because you had sort of dueling orders from different judges in different places about which parts of the rule were enforceable where and all this kind of stuff. And so it's funny, I serve on a board now again of a liberal arts college in the Midwest. What was it? It was Title IX. And we just had a, kind of a thing come through to the board that said, it was just approving, this is actually the Academic Affairs Committee, but it was just approving an alteration to the policy. This is not sharing anything out of school, because it's an alteration to the policy that was basically, required, necessary as a result of changes to the rule itself. And so therefore the school is just bringing itself into conformity with that. But, the one that comes with it, of course, is like, you may be aware that, certain groups of schools or certain geographies of the United States are not subject to what otherwise would be a national rule. But we are neither part of one of those groups nor in that particular geography. So this national rule actually does apply to us until and unless it doesn't. Like, that's literally where we stand on some of these things. And that's an extremely, that's the part of law school that I just, and granted, like, I couldn't find my ass with both hands when I was in law school, which didn't distinguish me from, at least half the class, and everybody else was smarter than us. But that was those aspects of it, where you had to make these sort of fine distinctions between where things apply, where they don't, and kind of the intersection of administrative law and litigation and stuff that I struggled with. And so it's crazy, I think, to expect organizations and senior leaders even to expend the energy necessary to figure some of that stuff out. So my comment to the group was, because unfortunately I get sort of looked to occasionally as like, Dan, what's going on here? And I just said, I rarely say this because I don't believe it in my heart, but I said, this is one of those cases where whatever the lawyers tell you to do, just do it. Right? Like, it's just, I don't like that mode of leadership. I think we do it too often, but in this case, just do what the lawyers tell you to do, because you'll never figure it out. So you have that situation right now with Title IX. You have that situation absolutely with SAVE, and again, without checking here, but I think I was before, when I was wondering whether SAVE was nationally or locally enjoined. I think it's nationally enjoined. I think it's the Title IX that I know is in kind of a wonky enjoined some places and not in others situation. And so you have the financial aid stuff.
Hey, it's Dr. Ray Lutsky. Element 451 is hosting the AI Engage Summit on October 29th and 30th. This free virtual event features many of your favorite Enrollify creators and will explore AI's impact on student engagement, enrollment marketing, and institutional success. Learn how to tap into the power of AI to turn data into actionable insights, utilize predictive analytics, and monitor and support student performance. Plus, hear directly from current students on how AI is influencing their engagement and campus life. Don't miss my session, The New Traditional Students, online, working, and skills-focused, on October 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern. The AI Engage Summit is your guide to understanding and applying AI at your school. Registration is free. Visit element451.com to save your spot. Now, back to the show.
The thing about it, of course, is that these are repayment programs that are being challenged and that are in, some doubt. And of course, the effect, ironically, of the challenges is that nobody's repaying. Like, not nobody, but for the most part, the response of the administration, which, is kind of understandable, is, well, look, since we don't know what's legal for us to do or not do, then we're just going to freeze repayment in certain areas. So anyway, so there's that. But as far as the schools are concerned, lending, there's the FAFSA stuff, but like lending continues apace to the extent that it's able to be executed properly to the, in more or less the same way as it has been in the past. Interestingly, and I've just, it's not out yet, but I've just written a long thing for the Minneapolis Star Tribune that's under the title of College Just Keeps Getting Cheaper, but will it ever be affordable? It is true that the actual price of undergraduate education on average has been getting cheaper since 2004, 2005. This is not something that anyone thinks. It's just that it happens to be true. And it's because of this massive gap, right, between the list price and the actual paid tuition. But in real dollars, all of that is in real dollars, is the case. And so undergraduates have been for a few years now borrowing. They've been less likely to borrow at all, and they have been borrowing less when they do over the last 10 years or so, pretty consistently. And that's consistent with the gently, not much, but gently falling average price of college for them, whether you measure it as tuition or comprehensive fee or whatever. What that turns into, of course, is a great difficulty for colleges to hit payroll. I mean, it's a very direct relationship there. And the high school class of 2025 is the peak. Okay, so we're going to graduate this spring. We will graduate the last class before people got a little nervous about having babies back in the Great Recession, and so this is it. And after that, it's not like, it's this, I hate the term enrollment cliff, because if you actually see the thing graphed out, it doesn't, that's not a cliff anybody's afraid of. Like, it's, right. It's so dangerous, right? It's like, it squint to see that it starts to gently go down, but it does. And the lack of students will not be evenly spread. That's the real thing, right? It will not be evenly spread across all institutions. So it will be kind of scary, but, how this affects, but the regulatory landscape and the way that it affects strategy and how organizations are, how institutions are thinking about enrollment at both the undergraduate and graduate level. The lending is continuing. The Title IX stuff, you just do what the lawyers tell you to do. If there's a second Trump administration, the machinery of like what you can do quickly and what you must do slowly are just really very different things. And this is a gross oversimplification, but things that have to do with foreign policy, the executive branch can kind of snap its fingers and mostly do. Things that have to do with domestic policy, and I realize this is an oversimplification, but things that have to do with domestic policy tend to require a notice and comment rulemaking. And that is, my shorthand for that when all was said and done in the administration, for me anyway, was I thought, okay, you can get a medium-sized thing done in 2 years around here, and you can get a medium big thing done in 4 if you're really on it. And then a big thing, I have no idea how long that would take. Nobody's ever found out, because nobody's been around long enough, right? Since whatever, unless you happen to have because you won't really get 8 unbroken years. Like even if there's a reelect right now, well, let's just call it a reelect, it's continuation of a Democratic administration. There's going to be some new people that come in. There's some people who leave. Obviously there's going to be a new person come in. There's going to be a new president, right? So you have some different priorities. You won't really have 8 unbroken years. You might, in terms of like in spirit, perhaps in terms of maybe the main thrust, and maybe they'll stay on top of SAVE and try and make the thing work somehow. But I think that it's very hard to do a big thing, and frankly, anything to do with federal student aid at this point, I think, is a rather big thing. So on the what would potentially happen in a new administration. There will be the usual stuff of literally flipping the switch the other direction on, I guess, Title IX. I wouldn't conjecture as to exactly like what would change there, but it wouldn't be that hard to figure out. There's gainful employment. I suppose they would just do it again, maybe. Obviously, I don't actually, as somebody who was involved in it, maybe because I was so scarred by the experience, I'm not sure where borrower defense even sits as to whether something would happen there or not. I don't really know. And then on some of the other stuff, like what's to say with a SAVE plan and that kind of thing, like you could expect that to go away. So that'd be pretty easy to predict that, right? The business of, I personally regard the business of like, hey, we're going to abolish the Department of Education as just very unlikely for people to devote energy to. That would be a legislative thing. You obviously, it would be an extraordinary conception. It would require an exceptional imagination of executive power to eliminate an agency, a cabinet level agency, without Congress, being directly involved. So I really don't think there's any chance honestly, I don't think there's a chance of it happening. And so that's just something that gets talked about, frankly, from my perspective. And I'm a little bit agnostic about whether it would make a lot of difference either way. To be honest, I realize that might be a controversial view, but just the short version of that one is, let us imagine. It's almost like impossible, but let's imagine that Congress was like, hey, let's abolish the Department of Education. But if that's the only thing they did, you'd still have statutory authorities that all of which would still have to be carried out, right? I mean, you'd still have to lend. You'd still have to enforce civil rights. Nobody's got to stop enforcing civil rights. It would just go from the Department of Education somewhere else. So, not to, I mean, when you kind of look at when people make the argument of, hey, we should abolish the Department of Education, what is the argument? It's a non-crazy argument, which is that the existence of a single department, this is the only thing I've heard that made kind of sense. The existence of a single department creates an opportunity for there to be lobbying or influence or whatever directed to a single place rather than spread out in other areas. And this results in things that, small government conservatives don't like. Okay. I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe it's not, so like if you take, because before it was just in HHS, not all of it, like it was spread, like these things were going on before, right? The federal government, as people may recall from civics, had some moments of involvement in education, for example, Brown versus Board, and that kind of thing, right? Well before 1979 when the department was created. And so, federal government, I think, going to continue to have a certain involvement in education either way. And so I do regard like the let's abolish the Department of Education as mainly a political talking point, probably not a terrifically serious policy proposal. And the other stuff, that is kind of being proposed, generally speaking, follows the theme of sort of devolution of power to more local places. But again, that is so much more resonant, I think, at the K-12 level. And so if you think about it from kind of a post-secondary and postgraduate perspective, I'm not really sure how much that really means. And I guess the last thing I could say on that one is one of the things that I've seen, like in terms of tectonic changes, I don't even want to say politically, I want to say like culturally / governance wise, is people on the left being energized by the idea of state sovereignty, which is, which makes total sense, right? So could we end up, and this is just conjecture about the future, but could we end up in a world where you have more energized and perhaps better funded state level regulation on some of these things? Maybe. And maybe you already have that in some areas, and I just haven't been paying enough attention, but I think that's something that could conceivably happen, particularly if you had a second Trump administration, right? Perhaps you'd have state level, for example, civil rights administration. Perhaps you would get, there are state administered programs for student loans.
We could be talking about this for an hour, but I feel like in the time we have left, I do want to shift the focus a bit to international students who do not qualify for aid from the state or federal level, and yet have become a massive part of the economic impact of higher education in the United States. And you're on the board of Adro, which has a fascinating model for international student financial support. Could you just share a little bit about that and the idea behind that and how it works?
Conflict has raged between people for generations. And as a result of that, right, we had 9/11, and as a result of 9/11, trust me, this is going in the right direction. We had the seriousness, the tightening, the intensification of a couple of things in the money world, know your customer and anti-money laundering. And it wasn't just 9/11, it was also the war on drugs. And both of those things led a lot of regulations to push banks really hard throughout developed economies and acutely in the United States to know exactly like where all the money was flowing to and from, whatever. In the most stylized sense, I think everybody has this idea that Swiss bank accounts are secret and every other bank account is not. And there was like some truth to that in the past. The Swiss have gotten their act together a little bit because of all of this. But here's the effect. The effect was, if you come to the US or the UK or some other country from anywhere, right? You could be from Canada. It's just really surprisingly difficult to open a bank, to do basic stuff, right? We're not talking about, I'm not talking about doing like derivatives trading. Like you can't opening a bank account's a royal pain in the butt. And so from the institutional perspective, and certain people inside institutions, offices of international education know this, at least, as I've experienced it with small Midwestern liberal arts colleges, and I've always just kind of like personally had an involvement with various different international students that we're friends with, they kind of like put them all on a bus or van or whatever, drive them down to the First National Bank of St. Peter or whatever, and they help them get a physical bank account. And then it's still quite difficult to transfer money between, Mexico and the United States, pay tuition, all this kind of stuff. And that's because of that stuff, right? It's like, because, everything else in this world, right? We just do it with an app. We do it with whatever. Like it's not that hard. And you wouldn't think, and when Americans travel abroad, now we just kind of show up and just stick your card in the ATM, and who knows how the magic happens, but then some kind of money comes out the other side. You're like, it's good. International students face just a mechanical challenge that they probably don't even really think about until after they've figured out they're going to go, and then they start to realize that there's all this that they have to deal with. So Adro was created by some folks who, career-wise were inside the machinery at MasterCard and at major financial institutions. And they knew the know your customer and anti-money laundering rules well enough to say, hey, in a way it is possible to build a system that's fully compliant, that is doing all of we call it KYC and AML stuff, but in a way that from the consumer's perspective, so you're a student from, Mexico, let's say, and you've decided to come to Wheaton College in Chicago, whatever. You can download the app. When you're still in Mexico, you can download the app, get on your phone. You can't, and this is where you feel a little bit of the rules are still very much there. You can't actually do anything with the account, so you can create the account. And at this point, I think you can fund the account. Don't quote me on. Pretty sure you can fund the account, put money in it. You cannot do anything with it though until you physically stepped foot in the United States. This is where the regulatory stuff comes in. A couple other steps need to be taken, but again, still you're able to do that sort of validation, verification in a really smooth way. And then boom, you've got a bank account. And then there are essentially channels that Adro has set up to make it very easy for, let's just say it's your parents or whoever, whatever, it's bank accounts in Mexico to be able to continue to fund your bank account here to make payments, tuition payments or whatever to the school. So it's one of those things that, I really like fundamental sort of advances economically. I think the most important things in life very often are the most boring. And so there's nothing more boring than anti-money laundering and know your customer laws, trust me. And complying with them is more boring than the laws themselves, right? And so this is just clearing away. This is just efficiently complying with the law in a way that, from the student's experience, is just hey, I got an app on my phone. I have one. I'm not an international student, but I was able to, in order to understand the thing and whatever, I opened a thing and I opened an account. And I used it to pay tuition at a college because, it's a heck of an improvement. Look, it doesn't sort of solve, and this to me, and just elevates one level above Adro and say, international educating people who come to the United States or who come to Canada. The Anglophone countries are the ones that are the big net exporters of undergraduate and graduate education. They just are. And that there's no reason to think that that's going to change anytime real soon. And so figuring out how better to finance that probably makes some sense. I'm not an expert on it, but as you pointed out at the outset, they're not, internationals are not eligible for federal student aid, perfectly fair. And there is a private market. I'm a co-signer on one of those loans, for international students to come and do their thing. So there's that, but that only goes so far. And I think because it's an important export, if you will, from the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, other places, maybe there will be some further evolution in the marketplace there to figure out how to, in a way that makes sense for everybody, right? That, to be able to finance more students to be able to come. It's not, at the end of the day, a very high percentage, large number, but it's not a very high percentage of students right now in American institutions that are from outside the country. And it's maybe worth thinking about, and especially given what I just said with the enrollment cliff, which is really more of a gentle roll, but that I'm sure is going, there's no doubt, there are plenty of people in higher ed administration at the undergrad and graduate levels that are thinking right now about hey, how can we responsibly, effectively serve students from outside the country, and is that an avenue for us to continue to fulfill the mission of the institution?
And a continuing dialogue, and something I hope we get the chance to chat with you about again, Dan Currell. This has been a terrific interview, and I appreciate all of the insights you've shared. And we will definitely have you back to round back on some of these things once we have more certainty. So thanks for your time.
The Mastering the Next podcast is a part of the Enrollify podcast network. If you like this podcast, chances are you'll like other Enrollify shows too. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, enrollment, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks all designed to empower you to be a better higher ed professional. Our shows help higher ed marketers and admissions professionals find their next big idea and feature a selection of the industry's best as your hosts. Learn from Artis Cadieux, J.C. Bonilla, Mallory Wilsey, Brendan Henkel, Brian Gross, and so many other of your favorite leaders in higher ed. Enrollify is made possible by Element 451, the next generation AI student engagement platform helping institutions create meaningful and personalized interactions with students. Learn more at element451.com.